I think a lazy approach for any agent is to treat everybody the same, right? If I represent this superstar, then I'm going to assume that every player that I represent after that player is just like this superstar. So what worked for him is going to work for this second person. I think the uniqueness of my model, and really, you talk about advocacy. It's like, I am not an advocate if I don't fully understand who this individual is outside of baseball, because baseball isn't the only thing in his life. Right? Chances are he's doing it because he loves the game of baseball, but he has other really incentives that are causing him to be the player, the person that he wants to be. So I better know what those things are, because those are the things that are motivating him every single day. Right? So I can't be an advocate if I don't know those things. Welcome to the first episode of the Advocate Podcast, the resource for parents and players on the road to Major League Baseball. For this first episode, my podcast team asked me some of the most common questions that I get as an agent: why I became one, how to best advocate for players, and then how to ultimately help them reach their highest potential. Now, I also tease a few stories from some of my Major League players that you're going to get to hear from here on this podcast. So as we get going, there's really two big things that you guys can do to help support us. The first is get this podcast in the hands of others who you guys think would find value in it. And the second is to rate and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. I cannot tell you how excited I am to ultimately hear from each one of you. And it's going to be through your feedback that I'm able to continue adding value to the next generation of Major League talent. I hope you guys are excited as I am. It's time for the show.
Can you share a little bit about your journey and how did you get into being an agent for baseball?
Me, like a lot of kids, you think you're going to play as long as you want, right? I got to a place where I knew I had the desire to take it as far as I could. I knew I had the discipline and the work ethic too. At the time when I was getting past high school, getting into college and playing college baseball, that was where I started to see, I'm probably not as good as some of these kids. And even though I was outworking a lot of them, it became pretty clear that, despite the fact that I'm going to outwork you, they're blowing past me. So at that point, I ended up reaching out to my junior college coach, who had a ton of connections in the game. And he introduced me to this one particular company. And the players that this company represented at the time were arguably some of the best players in the game. Barry Bonds, Mike Piazza, Curt Schilling, Trevor Hoffman. Before me, they represented George Brett Saberhagen. So they've been doing it a long time, and they still represented some of the best players in the game. So he basically shares, my phone number, or shares their phone number with me. And I'm thinking when I get the number, oh yeah, he's teed it up for me. I'm going to call this person. They're going to call me right back, and I'm going to go in and they're going to hire me. And this is going to be great, right? My future, I'm already planning it out. And what I quickly realized is that wasn't the case. So he had given me a phone number, but that's all he did. So I basically had to badger, and I left a message for this one individual every single day for about 6 months, and really just trying to get an opportunity to come in, to learn more about the business. So, kids today, they call that internships. Even at the time, I didn't even know what it was I was looking to do. For me, it was about, I knew I wanted to stay around the game of baseball. This is an interesting topic. I think I'll like it, but I need to learn more. And so, interestingly enough, after 6 months, I finally get a phone call back from this organization. They bring me in, they hire me on the spot. I start as an intern, which I continued to do for about a year and a half. And then while I was still going to college, they ended up hiring me full time. And so I started while I was in college. I started basically becoming an agent. And for me, initially, it was all about learning the business. I'd known plenty about the game of baseball, but I was quickly learning, this is a huge business. And funny enough, as I reflect back on it now, I think a lot of parents, players, aspiring agents, I think a lot of these people, they know it's a business, but they don't know what that means, right? They know that, well, yeah, there's a lot of money to be made in this business, but how does that affect me personally, right? If you're a parent, how does that affect what happens to my son? If you're an aspiring agent, how does that influence maybe the agent that I want to be or the agent that I will be? So all of these things are happening, and as I'm learning the business, I'm seeing it firsthand. And so I ended up staying at that company from the time I was 20 until the time I was basically 29.
You had your first opportunity to be at a quote legitimate, agency, get to see behind it. When you left, was that because you didn't like the way it was being ran, or what was it that made you decide to go do something on your own?
So interestingly enough, to answer the question, yes, I ultimately didn't agree with, I thought it could be done better, right? But what's funny is, so when you get in to become an agent, right, there are a lot of different pathways. One is, well, you start at the bottom and then you work your way up, right? A lot of agents start representing maybe a buddy and they only represent this buddy, and then they spend enough time in the business and then they maybe pick up a few more players and they eventually grow into maybe being a bigger agency. What's funny, so I started what I would consider like at the top, working for a company that represented some of the best players to ever play the game. And the unique thing about that, though, is I saw the flaws that exists at companies of that size. And I'll use like the term in the traditional agency kind of model. There are flaws. Really, really big agencies represent a ton of different players. And on some level, like I think their intentions are right. Everybody wants to do a good job, but the issues that arise when you're at companies of that size is very naturally, there's only so much time in the day, right? A lot of these big agencies have maybe a couple primary agents, but maybe it's just one, but they may have 300 players. And so sure, they're going to have people underneath that main agent that are going to be working with all the players individually, but ultimately that player is with that firm because of that one agent or maybe multiple, couple different agents. And the challenges though are now, well, who is that player really communicating with on a daily basis? It's not the one particular agent, it's every other person in that company, which that's okay. But if that main agent is the one giving you the advice when your back's against the wall and like everything's at stake, does he really know you? Does he really know what's important to you? Right? How much does he know you as a human being? And so in my model, like I need to fully understand what you want to accomplish in your life and really get to know everything about you, what makes you tick, what kind of player that you are, how you need to improve, what's your mental game like, all these different things I take into really designing my level of representation. And so I had that unique, I guess, view into the business, having started at the top and realizing, wait a minute, there are flaws that exist here. So instead of, wasting time, me starting at the bottom and working my way up, and then, 10, 15, 20 years later, I'm saying, oh, wow, I'm at the top of the top and I realize this isn't where I want to be. I started very quickly at the top and then realized, look, there's a combination of this that ultimately is what's best for the player. And that's essentially what I've created with Aligned.
And what does it mean to you to be, an actual advocate for the players that you represent?
I oftentimes say it's not cookie cutter, right? And what I mean by that is I think a lazy approach for any agent is to treat everybody the same, right? If I represent this superstar, then I'm going to assume that every player that I represent after that player is just like this superstar. So what worked for him is going to work for this second person. And I think the uniqueness of my model and really, you talk about advocacy. It's like, I am not an advocate if I don't fully understand who this individual is outside of baseball, because baseball isn't the only thing in his life, right? Chances are he's doing it because he loves the game of baseball, but he has other really incentives that are causing him to be the player, the person that he wants to be. So I better know what those things are, because those are the things that are motivating him every single day, right? So I can't be an advocate if I don't know those things. I can't be a good agent if I don't know those things. I can check a box, and a lot of agents do. They'll check a box and they'll talk to the team on their behalf. They'll tell them what they think they should do, again, based on what worked for other guys. They'll get them equipment, right? They'll take care of like any sort of concierge work that needs to be done. There's plenty of work that can be done. But again, like that is the type of representation, again, that I would call like traditional, where, yeah, you're going to represent 300 players and you're going to treat everybody essentially the same. And you're going to wait to see who makes it. And if, you have the right guys and they make it, great, you're going to make money. And this becomes your world for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And then eventually you'll phase out of the business or you'll grow tired of it. And for me, I saw, having worked at a company that literally that was their model, Like, that's not why I'm in the business. It wasn't why I got in the business. It's not what I think ultimately agents exist for, right? Like, if you actually identify what the true definition is of an agent, it's to work on behalf of somebody else. And so if you actually break it down, and like I've thought about this, it's, well, if my real job is to truly guide and work for players in a capacity that is best for them, if that's truly what my job, then shouldn't everything that I do every day be led by that kind of central theme? Yes, but that doesn't happen. Agents aren't making decisions. Traditional agents, anyways, aren't making decisions that way. What they're doing is they're asking themselves first, what do I think is best for the agency? And then how do I sell it on the player that this is also best for them? But at the core of what they're doing, it's all based on what they think is best for their company. And again, having worked at companies like that, I saw it firsthand, and it wasn't what I wanted to be a part of anymore. And so when I eventually left and then started my own thing, that was at the core of really who we are. It's why we called ourselves Aligned, because we are in alignment with what you want as a player.
Do you think you personally are responsible for kind of innovating the way that being an agent is evolving at this point?
I mean, I personally wouldn't ever take the credit for that. Honestly, I think we're just at the initial stages of it personally. I mean, I think if you were to ask the majority of people today, they would probably still assume that there's this negative connotation with agents. And there should be. You know, I think they're more focused on wanting to make money and wanting to be, you know, the best at that. And that's a fine goal. But again, you're never going to truly be as good of an agent as you could be if that's your focus, right? I mean, there's the old adage, like, do something that you love better than anybody else and you'll make more money at it than you could ever imagine. And I think a lot of that is true, but I just think agents, unfortunately, have gotten that backwards, right? Their focus has always been, how do I represent the best players and make a lot of money? And for me, it's like, what if we change that? And it was, how do we add the most value to the players more so than anybody else has? And so like that being our, I guess, guiding light has completely changed how we look at the business. And I would assume in the future, agencies are going to have to follow suit or they're going to become obsolete.
Absolutely. And when you're talking about like really being there for the player holistically, how do you support them when they're going through the tough times? Because like baseball is something where like if you get a hit 1 out of 3 times, you're a Hall of Famer. Like
Yeah.
they're going to have their slumps in baseball, let alone out in real life where they're like going through family things and all the personal hardships. How are you there to support them, or how do you encourage them through those times?
One of the things that we work very hands-on with our players with is kind of the mental skills. A lot of teams have individuals that work for their companies or work for their teams, organizations rather, who focus on that for the organization and the team. We actually have an outside firm or firms that we've used in the past. And I encourage my guys, no matter where they're at in their career, to really take the time and grow that part of their game. You know, because I ask players all the time, hey, what percentage of baseball is mental? And the majority of them say anywhere from like 75 to 90% mental, right? And it's funny because I ask them, well, how much of the last 2 weeks have you devoted to that percentage? That's 75 to 90%. And everybody says 0, right? So what they do is they focus on that 10% or that 20% that is physical, and they invest everything that they have into truly separating that percentage. And I just try to get them to like, look over here and look at this huge percentage that is untapped, that you've acknowledged is important, right? If the game is truly 75 to 90% mental, shouldn't you spend some time on it? So I tell them, like, it doesn't need to be 75 or 90% of your day, but if we can take 10% of your day and devote it there, and then maybe that turns into 20 or 30. And so for me, like what I just described, you ask anybody out there and they'd say, agents don't do that. That's not what an agent does. Why not? If an agent is devoted to truly adding value to a player, well, shouldn't they? If that much of the game is mental, shouldn't they be one of the stewards of that side of the game? And I think the answer is yes, right? And so for me, there's no limitation to it. There's no design or mandatory way of doing it. It doesn't need to be this way. It's how it's always been done. But why is it always how it's been done? I don't know. It's maybe the skill set of agents up until this point. Well, if my skill set is different, right, and my interests are different, and my desire to impact these players is different, then should that be leading me to figure out how I can add value to players too? And I think the answer is yes.
Absolutely. And how do you, like, what does it mean to you to help players actually reach like their full potential? Because I'm assuming in your eyes that doesn't just mean baseball anymore. How do you help them with that?
Yeah, it's definitely not just baseball. I think it's where it starts because it's obviously what the players care the most about. I mean, when you take a player, let's just say in whether it's amateur baseball or let's just say the minor leagues, like they haven't reached their goal of getting to the big leagues yet. Oftentimes, it's not a level of effort that is lacking. They all want it. They're all willing to devote as much time as possible to get it. But what's interesting is there's this disconnect between what's missing. Like, what is that next step that they need to take? And sometimes it's they're too hard on themselves, right? You know, there's an element of their game that they're having a hard time adjusting to, right? They haven't changed their approach at the plate. They haven't figured out how these pitchers are pitching them differently. And they're really struggling with kind of like managing that. So that's kind of where it starts. It's like, let's use the language and talk about the things that are kind of front and center for you. But ultimately, long-term, I mean, I think the goal is like, how do you see yourself being an impactful human being on the planet? And like, that's where we want to make sure that we continue to add value. So when you talk about guys in the big leagues, right? Austin Riley, Liam Hendricks, it's like, it's his third time being nominated for the Roberto Clemente Award, which is given to, it's one of the, if not the best award given to any single player every single year, where it acknowledges them for the work that they've done off the field, the type of player and competitor that they are, all these different types of things. But you know, you look at like what he's been able to accomplish and you look at like where he came from. This is a guy who not that long ago was going between AAA and the big leagues. He was designated for assignment, which not a lot of people know what that means, but basically he was taken off the roster in the big leagues in 2018 and he was sent down to AAA. And that was the first time in a while for him that he was not on a major league roster. So what that meant is if a team wanted to call him up, it wasn't as easy as it's always been. They could still do it, but there are other kind of challenges in the pathway of him getting back. Well, in a very short time, he is back in the big leagues, starting the game for the team in that play or the first game of the playoffs that year. And then the next year starts the year as the closer, reliever of the year, you know, free agent contract. And then there you have it. And so not that long ago, he was somebody who like was looking in the mirror saying like, this can't be it, right? But very quickly, he was able to kind of adapt and change. And I would give him credit because it all came back to his mindset.
I like what you said, though, because you're talking about how do you help them focus on the impact that they want to make on the world? Like, how do you help them get that clarity on, like, what are you going to do after baseball? Because even the best, at some point it ends. Do you help them find ways to set up, like, what's going to give them their purpose when they no longer have the thing that's always been their thing?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, sometimes, you know, they don't really want to have that conversation yet. Like nobody in the minor leagues, when they're trying to get to the big leagues, wants to talk about that because to them, this whole problem gets solved when I get to the big leagues and I become more influential. I'll do it then. And keep this in mind too. The likelihood that a player, let's just say out of the draft or in the minor leagues, gets to the big leagues, it's obviously a very, very small percentage. But in their mind, it's like 100%. It's a guarantee. So to them, when they're starting off in their career, you know, I may talk about this and it's like, hey man, we'll talk about this in a couple years, you know, when I'm up there and I'm doing my thing and whatever. And so it's not a matter of me like twisting their arm to like, no, we need to make sure that we talk about this. It's spending the time with them. And again, having the conversations between the victories, right? You can imagine a minor league season is extremely long. A major league season is 162 games, right? It's the longest season of any pro sports in the United States. And, you know, in the middle of that, there are obviously plenty of ups and downs. So you're going to have, you know, some guys, let's just say, who go on a stretch where maybe 2 or 3 weeks is like a really, really big struggle. It's making sure that in those times, you're spending time communicating, getting to know them, being there for them, because it's in those moments that like your relationship is going to ultimately grow. I mean, I can reference countless conversations. You know, I had one with a pitcher not too long ago, and he had gone out, he hadn't been performing very well. He's one of, if not the very hardest guy on himself. Like he is harder on himself than anybody I've ever met. And we spoke for an hour, and it was nothing about baseball, and it was all about life, and it was about failure, and it was about what it means to fail. And it, on some level, it was a little bit about spirituality, and it was really just, I felt like in that moment, even though I was his agent having the conversation, he needed kind of somebody else to talk to him. And so I kind of served the role as a brother for that hour. I served the role as maybe a best friend in that hour. But it's amazing because through that conversation, our relationship completely changed from the start to the finish. After that conversation, now I'm in a place where I can have more substantive conversations with him about other things in life, and it will resonate. And that's why for me, when I hear about agents not wanting to devote the time to get to know the player, or maybe they want to, they just don't have the time to do it, it's not as easy to say like, oh, well, no big deal. Your agent's just there to like negotiate your contract and talk to the team occasionally. No, he's not. An agent will never be as influential as he should be if he is not spending the time getting to know you on a level that like not many people in your life know. I mean, outside of like mom and dad and wife one day, this is the kind of cornerstone of your life. You're leaning on this person more than anybody.
And how do you balance that as an agent when you have different players on different teams around the country? Like, how do you balance actually getting to spend that time with them and build that?
I mean, so we're very intentional long before we even get a player, ensuring that, it's funny, like we oftentimes talk about this, like we've actually identified what is the perfect number of clients that we can have and serve with excellence, right? And it's kind of a foreign concept in this business because if you ask other players with other agencies, like, yeah, well, how many clients does that firm have? They don't know. Or, what's their limit on the number of players they'll take? Well, they don't know. And I think that's absolutely crazy, right? Because like in any business, you can't just serve an unlimited number of people the same. If you serve 10 people and then the next day you had 100, those same people can't serve 10 in the same way they did before, right? It's just not going to happen. So, I think for me, it's being very intentional before you even get a player to, number one, know about him as a person. Like, does he align with your values? And do we align with his, right? Is he right for us and are we right for him, right? I think on some level, whenever you meet a player, they're always sizing you up. And for us, like we also want to size them up. And we're pretty transparent with that in the beginning. It's like, look, we're kind of getting to know each other to figure out if this is a good fit. If for some reason it's not, like, no hard feelings, but I know how much time and energy we're going to devote in this relationship, maybe for the next 20 years, that why shouldn't I take that seriously, right? Why shouldn't they take that seriously? And I think the players have always taken it seriously. They always have. But I think the agent, again, and I say this a lot, the traditional agents view this business as a sales business. And it's not. It's a service business at its core, right? We work for the player. We are there to serve their needs. It's what we do. But if I, as an agent, approach this business from the standpoint of being a sales business, it totally changes my thought process in a meeting with a player that I'm maybe trying to sign, in a meeting with a family that maybe I'm representing. I'm now selling them on something that I think should happen. Well, is that being an advocate? No. I'm just a salesman. And so it's being conscious of that all the time. And the first step to that is openly talking about it. No other agents want to talk about this. They want to act like it doesn't exist. This is the most common thing in agencies today.
And when you talk about like doing what's best for the player, when you have a player who may say, hey, like, let's take this deal or let's do this thing that like in the short term may seem like the win, but you having seen things play out before, like, hey, there's probably a better way to do this. Like, how do you have that conversation with him to educate them and like help them understand, like, let's let's make a different decision here.
Well, yeah. So it's, similarly to like buying a house, right? You're going to find comparable homes in your neighborhood and you're going to try to draw similarities, right? Oh, well, our home is like this home and it sold for this. So that's, generally speaking, like how you can reason with players. And so for me, again, part of the homework is if you have a player who is at a certain position in his career where he is looking at signing a, big contract to any baseball player's contract, no matter the size, to a normal human being is a big contract, right? So whenever a player is in this place where he is looking at the opportunity to sign a long-term contract or a contract, the work that is being done is well before that contract is being negotiated. You're not, for the first time, if I was negotiating a contract for you and we knew that you had to sign tomorrow, if I'm now worrying about this the day before, like, it's too late. So the homework that needs to be done is well in advance of that contract being negotiated. And it's not necessarily the work that you're doing with the team, it's the work that you're doing with the player. And so for me, it's the education. So it's really helping them understand the process, right? This is the timeline of this. This is how it's going to go. Also introducing them into the thoughts of like, look, it's going to be emotional, right? This is how most likely you're going to be thinking about it and analyzing it. And, I'll be the first to tell you, don't ever make a decision when your back's against the wall, because more than likely you're probably going to make a rash decision, maybe not the best decision. And so that's kind of the first component, is really making sure that I spend the time needed to educate them in the process. But once I've done that, then it's a matter of, look, I understand you've told me what you want, right? Maybe for you, it's you want to stay with this one organization. Maybe it's you want to leave and go to free agency. Maybe it's, well, you don't know what team you want to end up with, but this is kind of like the circumstance I'm looking for. And so then it's my job to guide you through that to ultimately get you what you want, right? And so to use Austin Riley as an example, Austin, from Mississippi, right? Drafted by the Atlanta Braves. The drive back home is 4 or 5 hours, right? So it's relatively close. Parents are there all the time. He's got family in Atlanta. The Atlanta Braves approach us at one point about wanting to, keep Austin in Atlanta long-term. And the first offer that the Braves gave us on a long-term level was $100 million, right? And so when you think about that number, just not knowing anything else, not knowing his value, just hearing $100 million, like that was, I would assume, very strategic by the team to say, I'm going to get to a number because it's going to be so big that a player is going to want to take that number, right? So as an agent, my job is to educate him on, well, what does a $100 million player over this term look like? Let's look at him. Look at this player. He signed for $100 million. Look at his stats. Okay. Look at this player. And I go through a bunch of different guys. And through that process, he ultimately realized this isn't a fair deal for me, right? And the conversations that we were having at the time with the team were some that basically, made us believe, look, this isn't the last offer. This is kind of the start of this process. If we can't get a deal done, there's no guarantee that they're going to come back to us. There's no guarantee that they're going to want to spend more than this. But we're so far away from what looks to be fair that you can't take it. And so we end up doing a 1-year deal, right? He turns out $100 million. And in a very short time after that, he ended up signing for $212 million, literally like a month or two later, right? So in that short time, you can see how far a team was capable of moving. But what's interesting is, again, like, what is my job through that process? It's to educate him and guide him. In that process, he was having a very hard time with like understanding really what's too much, like what's enough money for him, right? Kid from Mississippi who, is building his house back home. Not a flashy guy by any means. Like, he enjoys nice things, but he's not just throwing money around, buying all these cars and whatever. So I think for him, what he was trying to figure out is like, it sounds like a lot of money. And at what point should there be like this breaking point of like, okay, this is enough. And so as we're negotiating, this is all going on behind the scenes. And I said, Austin, look, I think one of the things that I need to ask you, which should help you understand whatever the best decision is for yourself to be. I said, let's go through and let me just throw out in a few years when you become a free agent, if you turn this deal down and you continue on this level as a player, you're going to make more money out there. Like it's going to be more money, right? But let's talk about some of these other teams and the markets that you would play in. And I'm just going to use kind of the bigger markets that traditionally in the last several years would be teams that would have interest, probably the money to spend, not guaranteeing that they're definitely going to be a team that's interested, but like, let's talk about the possibilities. So I went through every single team that I thought could be a good fit. You know, Dodgers, Yankees, Cubs, Red Sox, Rangers, Orioles even. Literally went on down the list. And of all the teams I said, there was one team that he said, other than the Atlanta Braves, he could see himself playing for. And I won't tell you what team it was, but I basically told him, I said, so there you go. So that is the decision that you have in front of you. Are you willing to turn this deal down? And at the time, it was the team was at their max number. This is it. Take it or leave it. We're not going to penny more. I got ownership's approval. If you say no, like we're going to allocate dollars elsewhere. Not saying we're going to trade him. He's going to be here for the next couple of years. But you know what? Like there's no more conversations about multi-year deals. And so for him, Austin was basically like, look, okay, this is my last chance to say yes to this organization. And when we went through that exercise and he realized, oh, so I'm basically betting all of this on the chances that in 3 years, this other team is going to have, number one, I'm going to have to keep performing at this level. Number two, this other team's going to have an opportunity for me there, right? They're going to have an opening. They're going to have a need. And then number three, they're going to spend the money on me. That's more than what I'm being offered right now. And for him, he said to me the whole time, he's like, for me to stay here, like, this is a legacy play for me. To play with one organization for your entire career, like it doesn't happen anymore. And this is, if I was writing like my story, this would be the organization that I would put myself on. And here I have an opportunity to say yes to spending the rest of my career here. And I would say no because I possibly could make just a little bit more money. Like I'm not going to spend that money. And for him, that was the right decision. For another guy, maybe that wasn't the right decision. Maybe he would have said, I don't care where I play. I'll play in any market, in any team. I want the most amount of money because I want to do something with that money. I want to, start businesses. I want to give it back. I want to spend it. Like whatever. It's not my decision. So my job is to get to know the player, to make sure he's making rational decisions, and he has all the information in order to do that. That's my job.
And how do you, is there a way that you're able to help them? I don't know if it's possible, but to help them not take it personal when a GM comes to you and says, this is what you're worth.
Oh,
and it's
absolutely.
like way underneath what you obviously think it should be. How do you help them navigate that mentally?
I think on some level, it's helping them understand like this is it's a business, right? So it isn't personal. If a team, like when the Braves made the initial offer to Austin at $100 million, right? It's funny because when I was going back and forth with the general manager, I brought up one particular player and I said, well, this guy made this. We're obviously better than him. And the GM said to me, you're right, but we're just not going to pay that. And it's funny because like even right there, having told the player, but by this point, remember, when you're in the big leagues and you've spent a couple of years there, like as a player, you see it. You understand it's a business. When you're first drafted, you don't see it that way yet, right? Maybe you were taken in the first round, but even if you weren't and you were taken, let's just say in the 10th or the 15th round, chances are pretty quickly after you become a professional, something is going to happen and you're going to realize, oh, this is a business. This isn't just the game like I always thought it was. And so for Austin, he was in the big leagues now. This was his third full season. He'd seen plenty of things to show him why it was a business. So by the time that the general manager made this comment, he wasn't taking it personal. He wasn't saying like, oh, that's not right. He got, I get they're going to try whatever they can. They're running a business. And on some level, we're running the business of the player. And so we're just making sure that he's looking out for himself too.